Well, in the 1920s, when they started to cull the herd, and they were looking for, I talked about in the early teens, where they had looked to, first they were deliberating on how to best deal with this overpopulation problem, and how they were hoping to send them to different zoos at first, and the herd kept increasing, so in the 1920s they had to cull the herd. And one of the things I found is that they were trying to make revenue, since they didn't have a lot of income coming in to help sustain the effort itself. They started to try to make revenue off of the culls and to make the best use of the products. So for instance, make money off the heads, the hides, and to sell the meat. And that got to be a bit of a problem because of course they encountered tuberculosis in one of the first culls, so it would be difficult to sell the meat, especially the diseased meat anyway. So this posed a bit of a problem, but they essentially during the 1920s tried to make the herd more profitable by gaining profit and revenue from the culls, but also trying to breed the best bison in order to make the bison herd more profitable. So it's a bit of, at least today, it would be a bit of a problem in terms of preservation, where you're trying to make money off and breed the best bison herd in order to make money off the herd. And it is a bit of a problem in terms of thinking about sustaining a natural animal while trying to breed the best bison in order to make money from it. So that was one of the other issues that came out of them not having enough funding to sustain the effort itself. Well, annually they would round up the bison in the winter, because that was when the heads and hides were prime, and what I mean by that is that the hides are the thickest at that point, and so you can resell them. And so they would round them up every winter. Beginning in 1922, I think, was the experimental cull, and then they did it annually after that. And they would kill a number of the bison. And so I think it was after the experimental cull, they were hoping to kill about 2,000 a year just to keep the herd at a manageable level. And it didn't always happen every year. Some years it was a little bit less. And then they also sent some north to Wood Buffalo National Park in the 1920s. And that was actually just shortly after the experimental cull. So I'm not sure if there was a bit of public protest or not, or whether they had just decided to try a different avenue. But they did move over 6,000 bison north over a 4-year period. And that's sort of why there's that problem up there with, there was interbreeding between the plains and the wood bison up there. And there was also the spread of the tuberculosis to the bison herd up there, and it's a problem that is prominent in that park today. So that stems back to the 1920s, and then they were finding that that wasn't even helping reduce the problem, and so they, halfway in the mid-20s, they went back to culling. So they were still sending some bison north, but they were also culling the herd as well, and then they went back to just culling the herd, and they continued to do that till the park closure. And just to try to keep the herd at a manageable level, but that didn't always work. They were consistently the herd was overpopulated in the park, and they continued to have the other problems associated with that. Well, I think there was a number of factors that led to the park's closure, and I think it started early on. And part of the problem was at that time in the early 1900s, there wasn't a lot of understanding about wildlife science or wildlife management. And so when the park was created and when the bison were brought here, I think there was a lot of just putting them in the park and not a lot of consideration for carrying capacity or ideas of how they would survive on this sandy area, and especially if they were increasing. And so that's exactly what happened. They increased very quickly, and then by the mid-teens, they had the largest Plains bison herd in the world. And on one hand, people were excited about that, and on the other hand, they were starting to notice they were eating themselves out of house and home, and they were wondering about how to deal with this problem. So I think a number of the problems were unexpected from the beginning, and overpopulation in the teens turned into a crisis in the 20s. And by the mid-20s, they had 8,500 bison ranging on this area. And by the 30s, when they had done some studies, for sure, when carrying capacity started to be considered, 5,000 was the amount that this area could contain, they felt, when the soil was, when the range was at in a good state. And certainly by the 20s, it was not in a good state, and they probably by that time only sustained 4,000. And so really it's almost twice as many as the park could handle. So overpopulation was really a problem and unexpected, as I said. And then the cost of maintaining this herd, they didn't really have enough funding coming to them to maintain the herd. They wouldn't have had certainly the same tourist base coming as they would have in Banff or Jasper. And from what I've read, they weren't charging tourists to come anyway, so they wouldn't be getting any revenue from that standpoint. So they really didn't have the funding to correct any of the problems that they had. And they did have a number of people come and doing investigations from 1923 and throughout the 30s, but they didn't have the funding to put the remedies in place. And there's places where they say that they knew what they needed to do. They knew they needed to, well, they were culling the herd, but they knew they needed to get new pasture range. And they had actually land available on the east side of the park, but they weren't able to fence it. And I'm assuming that's because they didn't have the money. They did some small, implemented some small recommendations, but any of the larger recommendations they were given by the experts, they weren't able to implement. And then on top of that, there was the problem of disease, which was discovered in the late teens and especially in the 20s during the culls. They discovered it was quite high percentage among the buffalo that were being culled, and it wasn't really noticeable visibly. The animals weren't exhibiting these signs, but when they were culling the animals, they were noticing that the incidence was quite high among the bison they were culling. And so this only progressed and snowballed, and as the herd continued to increase, even though they were culling them every year, the herd continued to decrease with the offspring, and so the herd was still always overpopulated in the park. And so disease continued to spread, and they were never able to eradicate it.